This week we are going to continue with our discussion of 19th century fiction, but we're focusing this time about fiction after the Civil War. What I would like you to be able to know by the end of this lecture is be able to discuss the changes in American society which were substantial after the Civil War, explain the development of American fiction, particularly identifying the characteristics of realism and naturalism, and finally read and discuss authors in the realism and naturalism movements. As we discussed last week, the fiction before the Civil War, the Romanticism and its offshoot Gothic literature, was both optimistic and sometimes fantastic and supernatural. They dealt with idealized people in positive settings. The Civil War and the loss of over 600,000 lives and the destruction of the South made people reevaluate life. And so you get two developments in fiction. One is realism with its subsection regionalism, and a more extreme form of realism, naturalism. So what was America like after the Civil War? First of all, the North was triumphant. It had defeated the South. The South was humiliated. Its economy was destroyed, and much of its social structure was reoriented. Immediately afterwards, Reconstruction took place, but that only lasted a little while, and soon a white majority created the Jim Crow laws that reinstituted the segregation that existed up until the 1960s. We also saw the growth of cities, including the great architectural and engineering feats, including the Brooklyn Bridge, which was built in 1885, and one of the great engineering feats of the world at that time. It also saw the growth in immigration. Huge numbers of people came from Europe to the United States, and also many of the inventions that we see today got their start in the late 1800s with electricity and light bulbs, telephone. The first talking motion picture was done in 1895. It didn't last very long, and it took another 30 years or 40 years before real talking motion pictures became popular, 1929 to be precise. A reconstruction of the South began in 1866 through 1877. It started with the 15th Amendment, which gave rights to black male voters. Note it was black male voters. For the most part, women were not allowed to vote anywhere in the United States. There were a couple of Western states that did allow women to vote. The control of the South went from the with the Democratic help, went from back to right rule. Immediately after Reconstruction, many African Americans were elected to government positions, including the U.S. Congress, but with the return of white rule, most of them were banned from any political activity. In the 1880s to about 1910 is a period called the Gilded Age. The term was coined by Mark Twain, and it was about the huge wealth in the hands of very few people, like the Carnegies, Mellons, and Vanderbilts. During this time, most of the wealth of the United States was concentrated in a few hands, even more so than today. They had a lavish spending and lifestyle, as you can see from this dining room, from the breakers in Newport. But at the same time, in other parts of the country, there was deep poverty, particularly in the cities, where many of the immigrants were forced to live. And also, there were terrible working conditions. There was no worker protections. Child labor was very common. 10, 12-hour work days. If you were injured on the job, you were out of a job. There was no workers' compensation. So working conditions were terrible. And so you start at the end of the Gilded Age seeing the rise of unions and labor riots. The Indian question was what to do with the Indians as white settlers started to move into Indian territory. In 1851, the Indian reservation system was set up, where Indians were not allowed to leave reservations without permission. As immigrants and others moved into the Great Plains states and to the west, they started pushing the Native Americans out and onto more and more reservations. Of course, the Indians objected, and so we have a number of Indian wars during this period, including the infamous one of Custer's Last Stand. Under industrialization took place with the concentration of wealth. Big business brought greed and corruption. There was no such thing as antitrust and anti-monopoly regulations, so businesses took advantage of people and bribed government officials. And you have the inventions of the telephone, electric lights, both of which made major differences in communication and how people saw and lived after dark. Immigration was a big influx. The Statue of Liberty was dedicated in 1885, 1886. Most of the immigrants came from Germany, Britain, with many from Ireland. Many were Jewish, coming from Eastern Europe, and of course the Italians, particularly from southern Italy. Up until 1882, particularly on the West Coast, was a huge influx of Chinese immigrants. They helped build the transcontinental railroad that connected the East Coast with California and worked in many of the mines and other industries. It was decided that they were too foreign, and so they were prohibited from immigration. About 15 million people came into the country during this period and increased the population of the United States by about 20%. So, how does this relate to realism? The idea of realism was articulated or talked about first by William Dean Howells, and his definition of it is realism is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of materials. If you read Rip Van Winkle last week, Rip Van Winkle is not a real character. It's not a person that you can say actually lived. And so Howell wanted something written that was actually real people. Now, realism was an international movement. The Americans did not invent realism as a form of writing or approach to writing. You have Anton Chekhov in Russia, Gustave Flaubert in France, but it was William Dean Howells that set the American standard for realism. And that was to reproduce the life scene around him. It was meant to be unsentimental, not fantastical, not supernatural, but how people lived in daily life. And two authors that you may read are Mark Twain and Louisa May Alcott. So what are the elements of realism? Insistence upon and defense of the experience of the commonplace. So you're not going to get stories about kings and queens or castles. You're not going to get stories about ghosts and goblins. But you're going to get stories about people living everyday life and trying to survive. Character is more important than plot, so how people act and how they behave is more important. They rebelled against the romanticism of romantic writers. The emphasis was upon morality, often self-realized, and upon an examination of idealism. So the way you behave was not going to be dictated by outside sources, but by your own personal sense of morality. And they also thought that the concept of realism was a realization of democracy. If you're talking about ordinary people, it is ordinary people that make up the democracy. Some of the authors were Mark Twain, and you have a chance to read A Dog's Tale in your discussion, or Louisa May Alcott's Cousin's Tribulation story. Other realistic writers were Henry Adams and O. Henry. They are a little bit beyond the time period we are talking about, so we're not looking at them. Regionalism was taking realism and applying it to specific situations or areas of the country. And so it reflected the regional diversity of America. Oftentimes they reflected the marginalized groups in America and celebrated the spirit of American individualism. You have Mark Twain in the West and Mississippi with Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and some of his stories about the California Gold Rush. We have Joel Chandler Harris, who lived in Atlanta and wrote Brer Rabbit and collected Native African American stories so that they would be preserved. Bret Hart in the West, and he went on a trip to Mexico and disappeared, was never found. Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, one of the first feminists. Most of her stories are about women in undesirable marriages or abusive situations. You have Charles W. Chestnut, an African American. I know he does not look it. Both of his parents were African American, and he always claimed that he was African American. And Charles Alexander Eastman, who is Native American. Most of his stories are about the Native Americans' experience, particularly the Sioux tribe of which he was a member. Naturalism was not only a literary movement, it was also an artistic movement. It was man against nature, as you can see in this picture. Not only do you have the sharks, you have the storm brewing behind him. Naturalism elements consisted of pessimism. While the Romantic period looked at optimism and the world was going to be better, the naturalists tended to look at the world as getting worse. They were influenced by social Darwinism, which is the ethical theory that the strong should rule. Darwinism stated that animals evolved from survival of the fittest. Well, social Darwinism said that society should be governed by those that are the fittest to rule. Those who are the wealthiest, those who are the strongest, those who are the fittest should rule those that are inferior. They oftentimes emphasize economic and social forces that affected people. It was man against nature, nature being impersonal and uncaring. And it also looked at the deterministic concerns with biological forces. A person may succeed or fail because they are either physically fit or mentally fit to succeed, or not physically or mentally fit to succeed. Authors that are naturalistic are Jack London, which you read last week, To Build a Fire. This week you can read either Stephen Crane, The Open Boat, which is set off the coast of Florida, Cocoa Beach and Ponce Inlet. And then for your exploration, you will be reading Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. Another naturalistic author is Theodore Dreiser. Again, he's a little bit too late for what we are going to discuss. So, to summarize, after the Civil War, America changed to an industrial and immigration nation, which changed the way people looked at the world. The late 19th century saw the development of American fiction with two trends in fiction that emerged: realism, talking about ordinary people, and naturalism, people against society and nature. Here are some resources that you can use if you need to do further research. Please do the quiz that is attached to this. This is graded, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.